Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to put your hands together for one of the graduates of UWA who's been entertaining us, Rick Stern. Thank you very much, Rick. Good evening. For those I haven't had the opportunity to meet, my name is Warren Kerr, and in my role as the Warden of Convocation, I'll be chairing our proceedings this evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first ordinary meeting for 2015. I'd particularly like to welcome our guest speaker, Adjunct Professor Sue Murphy, former Chancellor and former Governor, Dr. Ken Michael AC, Vice-Chancellor Paul Johnson, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Community and Engagement, Professor Kent Anderson, the Guild President, Lizzie O'Shea, the Deputy Warden of Convocation, Mr. Paul McCann, AM, members of the UWA Senate, council members of Convocation, and all members of Convocation, including their guests and friends. Welcome. It's great to have you all here this evening, and when I say all, I mean all. We have a record number attending this evening, and in fact, as part of this, we found out what the limit to the having the use of this hall is actually meant in terms of numbers, so thank you for your support. We may need to actually hold future meetings, I think, in Winthrop Hall. However, wherever we meet is the custom of the university, and therefore of Convocation, to recognise that our activities take place on Noongar land and that the Noongar people are the spiritual and cultural custodians of this land, where they continue to practice their values, beliefs and languages. I believe that we should also recognise that tonight we are celebrating Convocation Day on the 102nd anniversary of our first meeting, which took place on the 4th of March 2013 in St George's Hall in Hay Street. So, happy Convocation Day. I'll now formally declare the meeting open at 6:32 and note that I have apologies from the Chancellor, Dr. Michael Chaney, AO, who tells me he's on a plane from Melbourne and therefore a tad difficult to get here, and over 1,000 other members of Convocation who sent in their best wishes for the meeting. Can I ask if anyone wishes to propose apologies that have not yet been formally recorded? If not, in that case, I'll move to item 1 of the meeting agenda, the minutes of the second ordinary meeting held on the Friday, the 12th of September 2014, which bears a very close resemblance to those that appear in attachment A of the booklet for this meeting. Some of you may be aware that last year's meeting was originally scheduled for Friday, the 19th of September 2014, and somehow that date found its way into the record of the minutes. Despite repeated efforts to change this date, it has persistently reappeared. I'm sure many here this evening will have had similar experiences due to the marvel of modern technology. However, I'd like to move an amendment to the meetings to record that it actually was held on Friday, the 12th of September 2014. Are there any other amendments to the minutes? If not, as required under item 2, can I ask someone who attended the second ordinary meeting last year to move acceptance of the minutes with this amendment? Mrs. Pauline Tremlett, thank you very much. And someone to second that motion? Paul McCann, thank you. All those in favour? Aye. Thank you, I think that's carried. Can I now move to item 3 of the agenda, business arising from the minutes? At the second ordinary meeting last year, Mr. Ray Taus asked whether 6 p.m. was the best commencement time for these meetings. In order to obtain your views on this query, all members of Convocation for whom we had email addresses were asked to contribute their thoughts via an email poll conducted during October and November last year. The results indicated that those wishing to attend these meetings were equally divided between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m. Therefore, in a Solomon decision, Convocation Council decided that all future meetings should commence at 6:30 p.m. We hope this is a satisfactory compromise. At the same meeting, Mr. Peter Farr raised a query regarding the number and value of prizes that Convocation now provides each year. In order to provide all the detail that I didn't immediately have to hand at our last meeting, I've included a full list of the prizes and the awards provided by Convocation each year in my report, which is contained in the agenda booklet. Following the last ordinary meeting, we also received feedback from many who attended the meeting that you would like to have the opportunity to view the agenda papers prior to the meeting. Given the cost of posting out the agenda papers, what we have done for this meeting is to make those papers available online and to provide you with a link to the papers in the reminder email that was sent out regarding this meeting. This will now become a regular part of the process for all future ordinary meetings, so when that reminder email goes out, and that's normally about the time that all the papers are finalised, you will have the opportunity to download those or read those online if you wish. Our next item of business for this evening is item 4, correspondence. While Convocation receives enough correspondence to warrant its own post office, the largest number of emails and letters received since the last ordinary meeting has been in relation to the development of the university endowment lands adjoining Underwood Avenue and Shenton Park. Given that this was the subject of a number of queries raised regarding this at the last ordinary meeting, I have arranged for Convocation Council to receive a briefing on this issue, and I've also arranged for all copies of the correspondence to be brought to the attendance of the UWA Senate and also the executive team at the university. I understand that the issues raised by members of Convocation in this correspondence are now being considered as part of the ongoing decision-making process regarding the future development of these endowment lands. The next item on our agenda is to announce the outcome of the recent elections conducted by Convocation. Each year, Convocation conducts elections for the Warden, Deputy Warden and 7 members of the 21-member Council of Convocation. This year there are also 2 additional positions on Convocation Council to replace 2 members of Council who had resigned last year. The Warden and Deputy Warden are elected for 1-year terms, and each member of Council is elected for a 3-year term. In addition, Convocation also arranges elections for 4 members of the UWA Senate who hold office for 4 years. This year, an election was held for 1 member of the Senate. First, for the Warden and Deputy Warden of Convocation. The term of appointment, as I've just mentioned, outlined in the statutes for the Warden and the Deputy Warden, is only for 1 year. This year, there was only 1 nomination for each position. Hence, I have been informed by the WA Electoral Commission that I have been duly elected as the Warden and Paul McCann as the Deputy Warden for another term. Both Paul and I wish to thank all of them. Both Paul and I wish to thank all of those who believe that our continuity in these roles is beneficial, especially during the implementation of our reform program. Now to the elections of Convocation Council. As I just indicated, normally there are elections for 7 positions each year, but due to the resignations of 2 members of Council last year, there were 9 positions up for election this year. After the close of nominations, I was informed by the WA Electoral Commission that the following candidates had submitted valid nominations: Paul Appleton, Devon Cuneo, Jennifer Lowe, Kelvin Mahuka and Diana Silveris. As the number of nominations was less than the number of vacancies, I have pleasure in formally declaring each of them elected to the Council of Convocation. Please congratulate these council members. Since the close of nominations, we have received 4 other nominations from members of Convocation interested in being appointed to Council. If there are no other nominations for these positions, I'm advised by the University's Legal Counsel that under the provisions of Statute 9, I can formally declare these candidates as appointed to Convocation Council. If there are no other nominations, could I ask that each of these candidates stand as I call out their name? Peter Hopworth, Gary Hawkes, Con Abbott, and Graham Harmsworth. Under the provisions of Statute 9, I formally declare these candidates as appointed to Convocation Council. Please congratulate these new council members. These 7 new members and the 2 reappointed members will now join the other members of Convocation Council seated in the front row here this evening as we implement our reform program during a period of renewal for Convocation. I now wish to pay tribute to the members of Convocation Council who completed their terms this week but did not seek re-election. On behalf of Convocation Council, I wish to thank Richard Harper, Arthur Hemstra, Tewu Sanosi, Tracy Taylor and Pierre Yang. We shall miss their input and their wisdom. Given that 3 of these council members played leadership roles, I must make special mention of the contribution of Tracy Taylor, who has been the convener of our Outreach Committee, which is responsible for functions such as the ordinary meeting. Richard Harper, who has performed the role of Deputy Warden, as well as convener of the Awards Committee, and Arthur Hemstra, who has been both the convener of the Communications Committee and also the Treasurer for Convocation. Please join me in thanking these retiring councillors for their service.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but are you quite certain that the statute does not require you to ask whether or not there are any people wishing to nominate from the audience here?
Oh, I do apologise, Pauline. I thought I had done that.
No, you didn't.
Are there any nominations from the audience for Council of Convocation? If we have a nomination, then we'll need to go to an election. We're happy to do that, but I'll call a special meeting for that because in the Act it's set out in a very great detail, and thank you, Pauline, for raising that point. We'd need to go through the following steps. Preparing voting slips which record the names of all candidates in alphabetical order, copy and then printing these slips so that each person here tonight can receive sufficient understanding of the biography and background of each person. Prepare, copy and print any material for each candidate wishes to circulate, such as the background, biography and information. Distributing all those to each member of Convocation here tonight. Request all members to then, and it's a very specific way that you have to then mark out the ballot paper, and then you have to place that in a sealed envelope and sign it, and then collect all the envelopes, and we would go through a process of then nominating all those. We would also have to select scrutineers for each candidate, open and review each vote to make sure that they are not invalid, and then count the number of valid votes for each candidate, check that all those votes have been counted, and then go through the preparation of that. Under the statutes, we would have to suspend the meeting until that's all considered. By 10 p.m. tonight, we should have an answer. So if this process, in terms of going through that, and we take it very seriously, if that is the case, then I will exercise my right as warden under Section 16.3 of the statute to call another ordinary meeting specifically for this purpose. So I think a number of people here tonight have actually come along to hear our speakers and wish to get home before midnight. I don't wish to dissuade anyone from being a member of Convocation Council, but we haven't yet had set up outside the photocopying and the staff to do that. So I'll call a separate ordinary meeting and I'll provide details to all of you who have email addresses, and we'll notify you the details of that meeting so that we can go through that process. Thanks, Pauline, for raising that. Yep. I now wish to pay tribute to the members of Convocation Council who completed their terms this week but did not seek re-election. And I've been through that, I think, before Pauline raised that point. As I mentioned earlier, there's also been a call for nominations for one position on the UWA Senate. During December 2004, I was informed that the current member of Senate, whose term was due to end in March, had decided not to seek re-election. As many members will be aware, between 1913 and 2005, The Warden of Convocation was an ex officio member of Senate. In order to have the opportunity for the Warden to once more be a member of the Senate, I decided to nominate for this vacant position. As there were 15 nominations for 3 positions on the Senate in the 2014 elections, I was most surprised to learn that when the WA Electoral Commission provided its report on nominations, that I was the only nomination for this vacant position and therefore was elected unopposed to the UWA Senate. I regard it as an honour and a privilege to be elected to such a position and look forward to contributing to the future of UWA in this additional role. During my term in this role, I will consult with my colleagues on Convocation Council regarding their views on making more permanent arrangements to have the Warden represented on the UWA Senate. We now come to item 6, the Vice-Chancellor's report. This is included in attachment B.
May I comment on the last point about the...
Certainly. Yes, Cam.
I just would like the audience to know that, everybody involved, that to go to that election would cost in the vicinity of close to $200,000, which would impact on that. And I would ask all people present to be aware that Council took a decision to support your way forward in the interest of goodwill and common sense. And I'm just a little disappointed that if we would go down that path that Paul suggested.
Thank you, Cam. We shall, as the good book says, ponder those things. We now come to item 6, the Vice-Chancellor's report. This is included at attachment B, and I now invite the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Paul Johnson, to present his report. Please welcome Professor Paul Johnson.
Thank you, Warren, and thank you to everyone who's come along this evening to this first ordinary meeting of Convocation for 2015. You have a copy of my report in the Convocation ordinary meeting booklet, so I'm not going to go through that. I will just mention a couple of items, one which is very much covered in the report, and I'd be happy to talk more about it, and that is the progress or lack thereof of deregulation issues through Parliament. And the second is one that I'd just like to pick up on, which relates to the ex officio position of the Warden on Senate. But I'd just like to mention something about the University Act. Not that I can, not that there has been huge progress, but I think it is relevant to Convocation. I'm sure many of you have been following, perhaps with an ever-sinking heart, the debate or discussion that's been taking place in the media and on the Hill in Canberra about universities. Now, at one level, it's really good to know that our national legislators are so interested in the future of our institutions of higher learning that they are devoting valuable time in Canberra to consider the future of the sector. Unfortunately, of course, their deliberations have so far gone absolutely nowhere. And indeed, only today, this morning, there was yet another announcement coming out of the Minister for Education's office of yet another possible variant of a funding system for universities and a fee regime for students. I could say much about this. There are some details in the report about the position UWA took back in November. We were the first university, and so far only one of 2 universities, to try to give any guidance to prospective students about what a fee regime may be if there were to be deregulation. But of course there is no deregulation. We have no idea what the legislative regime for universities may be in the future. And I'd just like to point out one of the consequences of this. It means that we cannot say, and no university, no public university in the country can tell today's Year 12 students what the fee level will be if they start at university this time next year. Nor can we tell our first-year students who are now in the second week of their study, first-year undergraduates, what the fee regime may be that will apply to them from the start of the first semester next year. And the ironic thing is that we would not be allowed to do that to international students. By law, we are required to give full information to international students about the fee level that they will be subjected to before they enroll and before they are admitted into a program of study at the university. Yet we can't do that to domestic students because our political masters have so far failed to decide either to do something or to do nothing. Let me just remind you that the higher education sector is a sector that directly employs over 120,000 people. This university alone employs 4,000 people. We have a turnover of about $1 billion. The sector itself accounts for 25 billion. It's the fourth largest export earner in the country. It's more significant to Australia currently than the agricultural sector. But if the agricultural sector became the political plaything of a group of maverick crossbenchers in the Senate, I think the country would be up in arms. But so far, that's being tolerated as far as the future of higher education. And I make this point not about the specifics of the reform legislation and what may come out of that, but just the fact that politicians are imposing massive uncertainty on the sector. And it's not just for students, it's also for staff. There are 1,700 technicians and scientists across the country who are employed to support research infrastructure, the national collaborative research infrastructure. This research infrastructure includes some of the largest bits of scientific equipment in the country. We have a number of nodes of this national network here. We have, for instance, here at UWA, we are one of only 2 sites in the world, the other being Beijing, where we have a comprehensive set of nanosims ion characterization machines. These are essentially incredibly powerful microscopes, if you think about it. They can peer into both mineral and biological material. They each cost about $4 million. But the real cost of them is not the cost of the equipment, it's the cost of the incredibly specialized technical staff who are needed to run these machines. And they are used to probe into cancer cells, they're used to probe into mineral samples to determine the nature of the minerals and the age of the minerals embedded in the rocks and things like that. If the funding, which hitherto has come from government, which has now been blocked because of the dispute around university deregulation, if that funding does not continue, and so far at present it runs out at the end of June, we will have up to 1,700 scientists and technicians made redundant across the country. It will set back Australia's research capability by years or decades, and it will send a very clear signal to highly skilled scientists around the world: don't come to Australia because you can't trust the government, and through the government, the scientific agencies, the universities, research centres, and the like. You can't trust them to honour the promises they make. One other of these scientific nodes that we have here is the Indian Ocean Centre for a network of things called ocean gliders. These are very, very high-tech pieces of equipment. They look like torpedoes. They are launched. So we run this whole system for the Australian nation. We run it out of the engineering faculty here. And these ocean gliders are put into the Indian Ocean, and they travel beneath the surface for about 2 months, sending back to base a huge amount of information about current, sea temperature, and so on. When MH370 disappeared, and you will remember that got the world's attention on Perth, and what then became absolutely central to the search for MH370 was to get some sense of what was happening in the Indian Ocean. Virtually all the information that came out to support that search in the early parts of it, and is still coming out, came out of this ocean glider. network of scientific equipment. That will be closed down by the end of June if the government does nothing and if the backbenchers and the government continue their fight. So this is, let me say, this is not special pleading from UWA. This is really critical for the nation. And I have to say, I stand here in some despair that we are being so ill-treated as a nation by our political masters. Perhaps you might say we get the politicians we deserve, we voted for them. But I have to say, I didn't vote for this sort of behaviour. So that's my piece on the current political challenges for the higher education sector. I'm very happy to talk more about that, but you probably don't want to hear more from me. There are many other things in the report. I'm happy to respond to questions, but I would just like to make a comment about the issue of the warden of Convocation being ex officio a member of Senate for many years, but not since 2005, because of federal government, a change in federal government legislation and requirements placed on universities. It has been indicated by the state government here in Western Australia that they are considering a broad revision of the university legislation that applies to all 4 public universities. The University Act, of course, the UWA Act is the first, passed in 1911, and the other universities, Murdoch, Curtin and Edith Cowan University, the other 3 public universities, have been established by Acts of Parliament at different times. The Acts are irregular with respect to each other. They are not fundamentally irregular, but they're not consistent with each other. And they are, in some cases, outdated because the nature of university operations have changed, but also the nature of the overlaying federal legislation has changed. And 3 years ago, the state of Victoria took through some consolidation legislation to create more or less similar university acts for each of the 8 Victorian universities. The government here has indicated that it is minded to do the same, and indeed there's even been a suggestion that some consolidating legislation or revised university acts would be taken to Parliament in the next session of the State Parliament. I don't think that's going to happen because so far this university has not received any indication of what a draft revised UWA Act would look like. It's my understanding that one of the other universities has received an indication of that, but that there will be a lot more work to be done in discussion with that university in the Parliamentary Drafting Office and the Department of Educational Services because of the nature of the material that's come forward. So this does have an implication for UWA. We've no idea what a future revised act might contain. But of course there's always a prospect if we can talk with government about addressing the issue of the position of the Warden of Convocation and the membership of Senate. So there's possibly a window of opportunity there that we might be able to use, but at present we don't quite know when things may emerge out of government. But I just thought that would be of relevance to members of Convocation. I'm happy to listen to comments and respond to questions as well as I am able. I'm not sure, Warren, how much time we have. I know there are some very important presentations to come.
Thank you very much, Paul. Will you join me in thanking Paul? The ordinary meeting is an opportunity for any member of Convocation to ask a question. So if we have questions, could I ask you to raise your hand, stand up and please announce your name. We have a roving mic at the request of overseas members of Convocation. We record these meetings, so if you could just wait until the mic gets to you and then state your name and your question clearly. Thank you.
Murray Rosenberg. Thanks very much, Professor Johnson, for your talk. I have a question about really my understanding of the fee increase, which I understand the proposal is that the government would reduce their funding by 20% and the university in response would have a flat fee for whatever degree you're studying of $16,000 per student. Currently that fee, I understand, is in the band from $6,000 to $10,000. So on my calculation, that works out for the poor student of an increase of 160% to 160%. So am I incorrect in what the student's going to have to pay next year in comparison to this year, if that proposal of the government goes ahead? Or have I got this wrong? It does seem to be a fairly large increase for students compared to the 20% drop the government might do. Have I got this?
Yeah, that's broadly right. At present, the government contributes about 60% of the fee element, and the student contributes about 40%. So, to compensate for a 20% reduction from the government, there needs to be a 30% increase from the student, just to be revenue neutral. There have also been 2 inquiries into university financing. The Bradley Review in 2008 and the Lomax-Smith Review in 2011, both commissioned actually by the previous Labour governments. Both of those reviews indicated that universities in Australia were significantly underfunded for the teaching. Not in absolutely every subject area, but overall they were underfunded by something around or above 10%. So in order to match that, then there needs to be another increase above and beyond what had been set out by the government. Now, I should say there are also complexities in the proposals that were put forward by the government. So the government's contribution is paid differentially according to the subjects of study. So the proposal that was presented by the government in the May budget last year, with the 20% cut and the then increase in the student contribution, would mean that to have a revenue neutral position, so no additional dollar coming into the university, for any student in science and engineering, the fee that would need to be charged is $14,237. So you add you add 10% onto that, and you're coming up to about the 16,000. And of course, for this university, the majority of our students are science and engineering students. So we decided that. So we were looking at this in 2 ways. What do we need to cover the teaching costs for the majority of our undergraduate students? And that comes out at about $16,000. That's not generating huge amounts of additional revenue. That's just dealing with the cuts that the government is talking about in the science and engineering area. As an aside, I have to say, why would you impose a bigger cut on the government funding for science courses? At the same time, you have the chief scientist saying we want more students to study the science and technology subjects. I don't see this as being terribly joined up policy, but nevertheless, that's what the government proposed. We then thought, how do we set a fee and make it clear to students what they are going to be called upon to pay? Because, as many of you will know, we undertook a major reform of the curriculum in 2012. This university is the only university in the country where we have a single entry qualification, minimum entry threshold. We say if you have an ATAR of 80, you can come to this university. So the average is about 93, I think, for our first-year students. But if you have an ATAR of 80, you can be admitted, and you can choose to study any of the 4 basic degrees of arts, commerce, science, or design. And then even if you come in, say, as a commerce student, you can actually, if you then find that it's the science subjects that you particularly favour, you can move across to science. And we want commerce students and art students to take some science units and vice versa, because the graduates of today need to be scientifically aware, numerate, literate, and creative. So what we realised was that if we mimicked the government's differential funding, we would be saying to students, we want you to make choices when you come here as an undergraduate that allow you to follow your intellectual passion. But by the way, if you take this choice, it'll cost you $2,000 a year more. If you take that choice, you might get a rebate. So what we had was a very, something the university had worked on for years. What is the right structure to prevent students at the age of 16 or 17 making choices about their future course of study, which then lock them in? And that was the whole basis of new courses. Let students come in, let them experiment, let them take courses or units in oceanography and psychology and philosophy that they may not have had access to at high school, and then let them decide what they're going to major in. So we wanted to keep that choice open and not muddy it, having established this, and we're the only university in the country that has that degree of transparency. And we didn't then want to muddy it by saying we're going to layer on top of that a hideously complex system of differential funding that mimics the government. So we thought $16,000 flat rate is probably, $2,000 per unit, whether it's an arts unit or a science unit. We thought was the simplest way to do that. We're also actually very aware of the fact that our graduates, typically, with the exception of those who take a professional route into medicine or dentistry or something like that, but on graduation, at the completion of an undergraduate degree, UWA graduates tend to earn pretty much the same regardless of what they've studied. In fact, we've just got some data this week which shows that our arts graduates have not only the highest employment rates of arts graduates of any Australian university, but also the highest earnings in the first couple of years of employment of any arts graduates in an Australian university. And their earnings are not much different from science graduates. So that was the thought process we went through to arrive at that figure.
Thanks very much. I think Joan Pope had a question from the rear.
Thank you, Warden. Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. May I just move from current students to a piece of, it may be information or it may be misinformation, and I'd welcome your clarification. Some of us are a little concerned to hear that the Director of the Extension Service has not had her contract renewed. This, of course, is a shame for her, of course, but more particularly, some of us are concerned about the future of the Extension Service, which when some of us were around university was called the Adult Education Service, and in fact was a series of lectures which began in the 1890s, well before the university itself began. It has an extraordinary and honourable history, and I would welcome your clarification on the fate, if there is such a word in that context, of the Extension Service.
Well, thank you for that question, Joan. And I will talk about the Extension Service. I will never talk about individual staff members because I don't think that's ever appropriate. The University Extension Service, as it was originally termed, was a significant part of this university, and it was very important. I have to say, over the last 6 years, it has dwindled to almost nothing. And that has nothing to do with the people who are running it. It has everything to do with technology. Because what's happened is that people are no longer signing. This is not a UWA issue, this is worldwide. People are no longer signing up to extension courses. Why not? Because there's a huge amount of access to online learning. Now, we've heard many stories about various things being killed off by the digital revolution. Some people are saying bookshops are being killed, newspapers are being killed. But one thing I can tell you, university extension services are being killed. Last year, in terms of what the University Extension Service offered, it was essentially a small number of face-to-face courses around photography, creative writing, how to manage a bed and breakfast business. These are not university. None of these were led or taught by any member of academic staff of the university. And then in parallel to that, UWA Extension made available a number of online courses which were all taken as a franchisee from a provider in the United States. So the reality is the demand has dropped away. Where we still have significant demand and interest is in the very extensive series of public lectures, of course, that we conduct in the university. And we want to do more to make sure that we appropriately advertise these public lectures, but also, I would say, broadcast them. We can podcast lectures so that they're available not just to those who have the opportunity to come along at the time they're being given, but also at other times. And we're also undertaking work, and this will let me give a flag of something that we intend to do, though it's not yet gone through any formal processes or academic approvals. But we are seriously considering introducing a Masters of Studies degree, which would primarily be focused around the arts faculty and around the humanities, literature, history, political science, which would allow members of the community, who have degrees and so on, but who want to study, but not specifically to study for a professional qualification. They don't want to become an engineer or an accountant. They actually want to study because of the joy of learning. And there is actually no structure within the university for people to be able to do that and to do it and to really focus on that and then get the recognition that all that hard work deserves, which is a degree at the end of it. So, Joan, it is the case that UWA Extension is shrinking and shrinking away. As I say, it is nothing to do with the individuals involved. It is all to do with technology in the market. But we are very alert to the need to recognise that there are many people, especially in the local area here in Perth, who would welcome the opportunity to undertake structured study at the university for a master's degree, and we're going to develop that opportunity.
One further question? Just wait for the microphone if you could. Thank you.
Charles Chusak. Can you, sir, provide an indication of the negative impact on UWA reputation caused by the suspension of Professor Jörg Imberger, and I gather a couple of other professors in recent times as well? And can I have a long answer, please? Thank you.
No, because as I said in response to the previous question, I will never talk about individual cases.
Any other question?
He did not ask about the people concerned. He asked about the effect on the reputation of the university of this happening, which is an entirely different thing.
As I say, I won't talk about individual cases, particularly those that are currently subject to investigations within the university.
One further question. Sorry.
I think, is the other person before me? Okay, I'm asking this on behalf of Jude Cullity, who I don't believe is here. If you don't mind, I'll just read it out, if I can get my phone operating again. My name's Michelle Marzo, by the way. Okay, so I'd like to ask you what the university is doing to sincerely redress the negligible, if any, presence of the Noongars in the western suburbs through their plans for Underwood Avenue. I'd like to know how the university is actively reconciling the relationship with Noongar culture through acknowledging and actively sharing in their ways through its plans for Underwood Avenue, rather than just expecting them to succeed in our ways and universities to be considered of true value to society. Rather than just pay lip service by acknowledging them as the original owners, isn't it time we gave something of real value back to them in a real act of reconciliation so that we may accept and share in each other's ways? Basically, I'd like to know what the university is doing about Aboriginal title to that land. Thank you.
The university's approach to Aboriginal title is, of course, subject to some of the broader agreements that are currently under discussion between the state government and the various Aboriginal land councils. But what I will say is that here at the university, of course, we work very closely with with Noongar elders. And as you see, we're very proud of our record, some details in my report of Indigenous students who study and graduate here. In terms of the specifics around recognising Noongar heritage, and that it is particularly important on this site, here on the banks of the Swan River, and as a number of our senior Noongar staff members often point out, this has for a long time been a site of assembly here on the banks of the river. We currently have plans, and indeed we are working with architects to design and build a new School of Indigenous Studies. This will be a $15 million, possibly a little bit more, $15 million new building, which will be in a quite a prominent position on the a little bit further south of here, but on the river side of the campus. Many of you will know the School of Indigenous Studies is currently located in Shenton House, which is the original heritage building that remains on this site, and is, I think, particularly inappropriate for a School of Indigenous Studies since it is the home of the original farming settlers who occupied this land. We also have very substantial plans as part of our centenary fundraising campaign to build an Indigenous Cultures Museum. We have been working on that plan for a number of years. It requires a lot of fundraising, and we're trying to carry forward that fundraising. But we've worked very, very closely now for many years with Noongar elders so that they are completely, I suppose, in the lead of in terms of the concept for that building and the design of that building and the naming of that building. And if we can raise the funds, that would be the most significant site of Noongar recognition anywhere in the city of Perth. We just need the $70 million to build it.
But my question is specifically in relation to Underwood.
Well, your question was in relation to native title and Underwood Avenue, and as I said, we always work within the guidelines of the state government and its negotiations over native title with the various Indigenous land councils.
We have time for one more question. I think the gentleman over here. Just get that microphone to you, and then you just state your name. Thank you very much.
It's Peter Alcock. Just following up on Joan's query earlier about extension. The University of Third Age has always had a connection with extension. Does this mean that we have no link now with the university? It's a long-standing one that is in jeopardy if the extension service disappears.
Well, Peter, a very good question. I'm not in a position to answer that in detail because I don't know exactly what the relationship is between the U3A and the extension unit. But any relationship with any part of the university is actually with the university as the entity, even though it may be manifested between through one of our operational units. But it's a very good question. I'm afraid I can't provide an answer, but I can find the information, and working with Kent Anderson, we can get back to you on that within the next few days.
Thank you very much. Due to timing, could you please thank Professor Johnson for his report tonight. I'd now like to come to item 7 of our agenda, the Guild President's Report. Again, this is included in the agenda papers at attachment C, and I now invite the current Guild President, Lizzie O'Shea, to present her report. Please make Lizzie welcome.
I didn't think that you'd have time to read my report, but maybe you've had a chance to have a skim through my awkward headshot that we had to do for the purposes of this meeting. So you're all very privileged to be the first time that I've had to put that in a document. My term started 1st of December, so about a quarter of the way through already. But every now and then you get little reminders that various things get to be put in place. So firstly, I would like to personally acknowledge that we're on Noongar land and pay my personal respects to elders past and present. I would also like to thank Convocation for having me and to personally take this time not only to congratulate Warren for his election to Senate, but to thank all the members of Council who have been incredibly welcoming as I add additional committees to the list of things that I spend all my hours doing. So thank you for having me, and I'm very excited to take the stand as the 102nd President. I joined a very interesting and I'm not sure of the right word for it, very special list of people, some of whom are still actively involved in the university. Sue Boyd comes to mind, people like Bob Hawke. I'm not sure if I'll live up to a number of his records, but I'll certainly give it a go. So I'll just give a bit of an overview of my report, and I hope if you've got any questions, and if you get a chance to read it later on, you can always just email me. But one of the things that I think the Guild certainly does need to focus on this year is meaningful engagement. So I've spoken in my report about the meaningful engagement that I'm hoping to establish with the executive of the university. So one of the things that has often happened, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, both groups have sort of respected each other's autonomy and independence, almost to a point where I sometimes wonder whether Paul hears any of the good things we do. He only hears when we occasionally end up in the news. So that's something that I am personally working on this year, and I think that's a really important connection for us to build. So I'll be having quarterlies with the executive where we can showcase all of the important things that students are doing on campus, not just that the Guild is doing. Because so many of the things that happen are things that the clubs and societies are running and support groups and things like that. And the Guild supports them with grants and leadership training and all of those kinds of things. We make sure they do all the right forms, but a lot of that barely filters up to the Guild, let alone filters up to the executive and to the broader community. One of my priorities for this year is looking at our engagement with student groups who have been historically excluded from the various processes within the university or the Guild. So we currently don't have any representation for students from culturally or linguistically diverse backgrounds or students of colour, and we don't have any representation for students with disabilities or sort of long-term illnesses and things like that. So that's something that the Guild, I hope this year, can find a way for those students to get involved and to have their voice sort of incorporated into our structures, because there's no point me trying to speak for people where I don't have that experience. So I'm trying to set up various structures so that students with those stories can tell them themselves. So that's something that the Guild will be doing this year that is new. To kind of top down through the report, O Week happened and it was successful. We had about 200 clubs on campus. I know some of you made the mistake of coming here on Friday. You would have found that every single car park was full, not only because of us, but because of, I think, a law conference and the Writers' Festival. I think it was the most people we've probably ever had on campus. I made that stat up, but anecdotally, I'm happy to quote it. What else do I want to talk to you about? Strategic projects. So I thought it's fairly easy for you to read my report and get the details on things, but two things I wanted to touch on. I was going to talk a little bit about the half cohort, but I'm sure you've sort of heard that to death. But that is something that we're sort of, both the Guild and the university, having to deal with, not just this year with a smaller group coming through, but the effects of that in the long term while we sort of watch them make their way through to graduation. But something I did want to touch on that's particularly relevant is the conflict between trying to have a campus where students stay. So I think Paul's go-to is sticky campus, where students want to stay on campus. They're here at 8 in the morning for breakfast. They're here at 9 p.m. playing volleyball. They're living in student accommodation, that kind of thing. The conflict between that and wanting to have all of our lectures online and wanting to be able to have flipped classrooms and have this online learning environment, I think is actually something that we ignore a little bit. So we don't really think, how do we actually get these two easily to argue conflicting priorities to actually happen? So that is something that we're having to look at. And that's something that hopefully in 6 months' time I'll be able to speak on again and tell you how we're going and how we are fostering a thriving student culture while also making sure that the online learning environment is supported, all of those different priorities. To scoot through, I did want to touch on some of the government issues that I've written in my report. I do try to look less gleeful whenever anyone says that fee deregulation is not going to pass. My stance in my report is fairly clear, and I think I do have the privilege of speaking from a student perspective where I don't necessarily, while I am a member of Senate, have to stand in Paul's shoes and single-handedly try and fix the problem. But I did want to touch on fee deregulation, and thanks to the question earlier, I think people would already be thinking about the sort of effects directly on students. And we do have a lot of students who have been saying to me that they, before it became clear that because they were enrolled already, they wouldn't be facing new fees, that they were reconsidering whether they wanted to do postgrad courses, whether, you know, their course was for them. If, you know, say you're in year 12 and you're not sure when you're trying to make up your mind, if you're facing that significant cost, I think a lot of people would err towards do a year of work, find out if that's what you want to do. So I did want to raise a few of those feelings, but also encourage you to take the time to think of the effects that would have on the university community, because the way that I have always thought about it is I have an obligation as a member of Senate to do what I think is best for UWA. And while fee deregulation may help the budget hole, I don't think it would be the best for what we want UWA to be. So I'd be interested to see what everyone is thinking about that. I'm happy to take questions on it, but that is something that I sort of thought as graduates and members of Convocation, you do have the things that you'd like to see UWA become, and I think given that we are the sort of custodians in 100 years' time, we'd want UWA to look a certain way, and I personally don't think that fee deregulation would lead towards the university that I would want to see. The other thing that I did want to touch on was the mention of representative elections for Senate. I'm pleased that Paul did the briefing because it's far more thorough than I would have been able to do. But I did just briefly want to touch on how I do think it is really good that Warren is on Senate now. The fact that I am an automatic member, I do think is really valuable. It is quite an interesting position to take up, and I do think the conflicts between being an advocate as president and being a representative voice on the board is something that is quite difficult, but I personally think that having the voice there is far more important, and I would hate to see the elected representatives lost off the board. So I do hope that if any changes like that are going to be happening, we all know about it well beforehand, and I would be pleased to have the support of the graduates in ensuring that Convocation staff and student reps do remain on Senate. So that's pretty much everything that I wanted to cover. Please do contact me if you would like to re-engage with the Guild if you were involved in your time as a student. Whether you just want to share a story or give back and engage, the students do get a lot out of hearing that, and I'm sure, you know, if you just want to tell me your stories, I'm more than happy to listen to them. But I do want to thank you again for having me, and I am happy to take any questions.
As Lizzie has indicated, she would welcome questions. Are there any questions from the audience of the Guild President? We have one just down here, and then one up in the centre there. Oh.
Ray Taus. In your comment of a moment or so ago in your membership of Senate, I'm a little unclear whether you're raising the question, is it to do with governance, is it something else, where you're raising, as I understood you, a disparity or a distinction between your role in representing Guild and your membership of the Senate. Is that what you're raising?
I don't know if I have to move that. Basically, as it's something that Michael Chaney makes very clear as soon as you step foot in the Senate room, that you are a member because you are the Guild President, but you are a member of the board with a fiduciary duty to the board. So I sit there as the Guild President. I'm sitting there because I'm the Guild President, but I'm there as a student voice for the betterment of the board, not with the interests of the Guild at heart. So the conflict, the reason why I brought it up is that perceived potential conflict is something that has been raised, particularly at Curtin, as a reason why the guild president shouldn't be on the board, but I've never seen a history of presidents failing to manage that dual role. So I've never seen any proof that the conflict is worth removing the position for. So it is something that I think is difficult to make sure that you're aware of, but Michael Chaney made it very clear that you're a member of the board with a certain fiduciary duty. So that's the conflict that is perceived there. But I think I'm doing okay. I've only had a few meetings, so...
Thank you for the clarification. Okay. And of course that leads me to ask, what does the Guild think of your inability to represent their interest in a direct way?
It's kind of, what do I think of what I do? I think it's interesting. I mean, as with the Guild being separate, you kind of can't really expect to have the ability to, how should I put this? I don't think anyone would expect the Guild to be able to sort of go in and, without comment on the fact that you were also a member of the Guild, directly comment on issues relating to the Guild without stating that. So I think Guild Council and the student body who are interested enough to investigate it probably understand that having a student voice there is crucially important, and having an experienced voice there, where I've been involved with the Guild for 2.5 years, having that experienced student there is important. I don't necessarily think that all matters, there's a very small number of matters that directly concern the Guild's operations themselves, like our accounts and things like that, but I think the distinction between representation and advocating for the Guild, I think is something that people sort of accept by nature of the fact that it's a separate organisation. So I'm not sure if I've just waffled on or I've addressed that.
There was another question. Sorry, just down here. Toby was coming. If you can just wait for the microphone. Please stand up and just announce who you are for the purposes of the camera. Thank you.
My name is Emma. Lizzie, you seem to be running the Guild very well because you're running on a surplus. What's your secret, and can you share it with the rest of the university?
Thank you. I am lucky enough to have a finance team who ensure that I don't have to do the accounts myself, so that's probably the first thing, but I'm sure all of you, if you have a budget and are dealing with a surplus or not, would have that. I think we had to really reevaluate in 2013 when I was a Guild counsellor. So I was a counsellor in 2013 and I was our education officer in 2014, and I think there was a long time where a deficit was just sort of accepted, and we basically had to go in and say, with the current environment, with the SAF funding that we get from the university, whereas previously, and my preferred option would be we got the money directly, but with the current situation that we're in, we do need to show that we can handle our finances, which I'm sure some of you probably have questions about, but that was a priority, was making sure that we had a good bottom line and cutting back on things that weren't directly student related, really prioritising, and we reevaluated our catering strategy. So a lot of guilds across the country don't have anything other than their university funding, and we basically thought if we're ever in a situation where we were to lose funding from the government/university, we would need to ensure that all of our other operations were tip-top. So it's been also probably the fact that we tried to do long-term strategy. I'm not sure if our budget is anything to boast about, but compared to some other organisations that are student-run, it was probably the fact that we had a really good continuation between myself, my predecessor, and Cam Barnes in 2013, where we actually managed to do some sort of 3 to 5 year strategy planning. But again, I'm not sure if our small sort of positive budget is something that I should be, gloating about. But thank you for your question.
We have time for one more question. Was there another one? Oh.
Charles Tuesday again. I looked with interest at your office bearer team and I asked what are the qualities you look for in a queer officer.
The officers are elected by the collective. As far as those autonomous officers go, and I guess it's probably something that I can speak of broadly for those groups, we do have two, and that's because historically, to be broadly representative of such a diverse group of students, we allow for two, where the alternate election is to ensure that you have someone sort of different from the previous one. So that's kind of how the double officer works. I'm not sure if your question is about what the queer department is or anything like that, but the queer department is a collective for all students who identify as, I might just use, I don't want to forget anything, LGBTQI plus, I think, is the current preferred one with the collective. So anyone who identifies with any of those groups gets involved with a collective, and it's basically a safe space on campus as well as an advocacy role.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Could I, on your behalf, thank Lizzie for her report and ask her to show your appreciation. Item 8 on our agenda is the Warden's report. Full copy of my report is at attachment D in your booklet this evening. Rather than go through my report in detail, I just wish to highlight two important developments that have taken place since the last ordinary meeting in September last year. Excuse me. The first is the appointment of a new member of the UWA executive with a responsibility for engagement with UWA graduates. And the second is the survey of graduates undertaken late last year. In my report to the last ordinary meeting, I foreshadowed the arrival of Professor Kent Anderson, who commenced in his newly created role as the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Community and Engagement on the 1st of October 2014. As this is the first time that Kent has had the opportunity to attend an ordinary meeting, I'd like to use the time allocated to my report to introduce Kent and to provide him with the opportunity to provide an overview of the results of the graduate survey undertaken late last year. Please welcome Professor Kent Anderson.
Thank you, Warden. Let me start off by acknowledging, as others have, that we meet on the Wajak Buja, the land of the Noongar people, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. It is a tremendous honor to be here. Thank you for welcoming me. And I look out and thank you for welcoming me at a personal level as well. I was quickly I've only been here for a few months, but I was in the lobby and I saw Pauline and we had a chat, and I saw Joan and we had a chat, and I'm sitting next to Ken Michaels and we were catching up. You have made me feel tremendously welcomed into Western Australia, into Perth, and most importantly, into our community of the UWA. Thank you very much for that. The warden asked me to come up here and say a bit about myself, but probably more importantly, to say a bit about you. We've just done the most extensive survey of graduates in the history, and so now we get to look back at that and take a look at what you're saying about your university, the University of Western Australia. But taking up the warden on his advice, quickly a little bit about me and where I'm coming from in this. If you look at the warden's report, there's a little bit there, but let me just emphasize a couple of things. While I didn't grow up in Western Australia, and indeed you might have noticed my what I call north of Queensland accent, I grew up in Alaska, and I've traveled a bit all over the world and lived in a number of places, but coming into Perth and coming into WA felt like I was coming home. Let me explain that. Alaska, like WA, is a place of immense beauty in broad spaces, with a concentration of population in an important urban area, an important indigenous community, an economy driven by resources, and a love of the community and the arts that surround that. The difference, of course, is I'd much rather be in Perth on a 38-degree night than in Fairbanks on a minus 38-degree night anytime. And so Somerville has been an absolute delight, even when I'm wiping sweat from my brow. My background is originally in marketing as a marketer for an airline, subsequently as a commercial lawyer in Hawaii, and then moving on to academics, Oxford through Japan, Hokkaido University, a professor of law at ANU, dean at ANU, and then a pro-vice chancellor for international affairs at Adelaide. All of which have been wonderful and all of which go to my perspective. But it's really your perspective that my job is mostly about and that I'm mostly keen to hear on. The university and its statutes, but also in all that we do, is about teaching. It's about research. But it's also about community. And is Sue Boyd here tonight? I didn't see Sue out in the lobby, but Sue always wants me to define what I mean by community when I'm there. I take a small c as broad as possible on community to mean both the internal communities, like Convocation, and the external communities, both within Western Australia, but moving outwards across the country and more broadly. This is the University of Western Australia. This is your university, the University of Western Australians. And while teaching is an important part and research is an important part, there is more that the university offers you and our broader community. For example, we know from the survey, and I'll look at it in a moment, that about half of you have come on to campus in the past year. That's phenomenal. No other university in Australia or elsewhere would have that number of graduates coming back onto campus. So obviously you value that part. This university is also unique in that not only did it found the Perth International Arts Festival, but it continues to run and invest in the Arts Festival. That's an important part of the university that is beyond just the normal teaching and research. It goes into those fields, but it is also bigger than that. And hopefully, I saw you out there on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday as we tried to keep up with the little girl and the diver as they walked the streets of Perth. Okay, that's a bit about me. Let me run through the survey here and the survey results. As I said, this is probably, as a matter of fact, I know it is, the most extensive research that we've done on your opinions in the past. This is done by Professor Gerald Pearson at Stanford University, who has done this kind of benchmarking for 40 universities in the UK, Canada, and Australia. And that's important because if we just have the information looking at ourselves, we can't compare it to see how we're doing. So that benchmarking is really important. 6,500 people, graduates, completed the form, and it allows us a pretty good sense of where we are when it was taken at the end of 2014. We're committed to this, and so we'll come back to it in the future, but now we have a benchmark from which we can see where we are. So let me run through this quickly. The first and probably biggest takeaway that comes around is this one here. And it says, generally speaking, our graduates feel really positive about their experience. That's the very satisfied up on top and the very positive feelings. In this space where you try to ask people and see how it's going, there's something called the Net Promoter Score. And that takes the people who think it was 9 out of 10, and it subtracts it from the people who think it was 7 or worse. And then it kind of drops the middle bit. And then if you've got a big number, you're doing really well, and if you've got a negative number, you're not doing very well. And you'll see from that, our Net Promoter Score was 17. And that's pretty good. But I have to say we can do better. If you see around that, this benchmark of 40 universities went all the way from a poor university that had a minus 10 to a great university that had a 64%. Perhaps the most similar university to us in Australia was a good 5 points in front of us. So we've got a lot of positive feelings out there, but we also have actually a lot of neutral feelings. People are said, yeah, it wasn't so bad. Yeah, it was pretty good. And so those are the people we're really keen to engage in the future. So what was it about the experience at UWA, or the continuing experience, that really excited you and others like you? Well, the number one that comes through very strongly is pride. Proud of having been a student here, proud of remaining connected and engaged with the university. And we go through a list of other things that come up, but it's really the pride that comes through strongly there. So what was important, or actually what is important to you about the UWA experience? The number one thing is students. You were a student, you felt that enthusiasm, and that's the area where you're most interested. The hub of knowledge is the second one. The idea of the research, the idea of exchanging ideas, the idea of debate. And the third one there is groundbreaking research, making those discoveries that will improve our lives, improve our children's lives, improve the world where we are. Some of the things that didn't come out as strongly as we thought were, one, this concept of global challenges didn't resonate with you. Becoming a top 50 university by 2050 didn't resonate with you as much as we anticipated, and being an accessible partner didn't resonate as much. So the takeaway message there for me is really around that student experience and that celebration of knowledge. And who do you want to hear from? Well, it's not the Deputy Vice Chancellor Community and Engagement. I can tell from the wonderful looks of enthusiasm on your face. Who you want to hear from is actually the person who preceded me, the students, and the professors or the academics. This is done by an American, so he uses the term professors rather than lecturers, and yourselves. You want to hear about alumni. And who do you, whatever, not as excited about? Sorry, Paul. The Vice Chancellor. I don't know if we have any deans in the room tonight, but apologies to you as well. The heads of schools, the Chancellor. Sorry about that, Ken. And the Guild President. Well, you're speaking as a student, not as Guild President there. I'm sorry, Lizzie. And the Warden. Sorry about that one. But that's really important, and you'll see in your alumni news, the email newsletter that we sent out, we've already responded to this. So you would have received your first alumni news, and you would have seen it was organized. So the three first photos you see, the three stories that are there, are a student story, a researcher story, and in this case, a young alumni story. So what is it that you want out of the university after you've left, after you've become a member of Convocation by being a graduate? Well, unsurprising to me, it's you want the intellectual stimulation of coming and being part of all that the university represents. The socializing, yeah, that's fun, but that's not really the heart of it as much as the intellectual aspect. Career is really important for young graduates. So this actually looks like, as a whole, it's not that important, but when you take just the slice of it, which is people who have just recently graduated within 5 years, it's really important. And one of the things we know, particularly in Perth, in Western Australia, is about 70% of jobs are gone through a personal network rather than a public appointment system. So that's really important for them. And then the volunteering. And a lot of that is the people in this room doing what you're doing tonight, which is giving freely of your important time back to the university and back to this community. And I'm going to do it right now, but I'll do it again and again and again, and that is thank you. Thank you for caring, and thank you for giving back. So where do you identify from? Again, this one was a little bit of surprise for us, but it's UWA. The university as a whole, where the identity is. I was anticipating it would be the faculty of science, or I was anticipating it would be the school of biology. But indeed, it was the faculty, or overwhelmingly, it's the university as a whole. as a whole. I also was anticipating the residential colleges would be higher. The program is a subgroup, or the research group is a subgroup. Again, Convocation comes out as a lower one on this as well. But the real takeaway is the UWA as a whole is where people's identity is sitting. So where does that lead us? Actually, I'm sorry, I didn't put it in as a slide, but let me mention a couple of three other takeaways from this, which I forgot to put in a slide. One is the one I've already shared, which is the campus grounds are really important to you. And we see that coming through, and that message has been heard, and that's an important part. Another one is we went out and we anticipated that you would love to be called the University of Western Australia, and maybe even with a capital T on the. But it's actually not what you said. 77% preferred to be called UWA. So you'll be seeing that coming through in a lot of our things. The very young students actually preferred UW, but we couldn't figure out how you actually spell that. And there was a third bit, but I forget it. So I'll go on to this. So strategic goals based on that, but also based on my new role here. And it's really about these 4 points. The first thing I'm really keen for us to work together with as a cooperative is to connect. I want to talk with you. I want to have those hard conversations. I also want to have the social ones and the fun ones too. But the first is we've got to connect. Following on that is we converse. You've told us you want an intellectual environment where you can have conversations about interesting things, because that's what's important to you in the university, and I want to, as well as others, want to have that conversation with you. And you want to be fed. And in this, it doesn't go to the social, it goes to the feeding of the mind. You want the stimulation that the university represents. And the last one is me, again, going back to recognize what you're doing here tonight, but that's contributing back to this cycle so that we can feed back to those students who need the support, your support, going forward, so that the cycle can continue for another 102 years and another 102 years. So the key findings, just quickly in summary, the Net Promoter Score, we need to do a bit better. We're doing pretty well. We're in the middle, but a place as wonderful as UWA, we should be doing better, and that's our goal. The importance, really the student experience is the key message there. The voices, it's the student, the academic, the alumni, not the Deputy Vice Chancellor community engagement, unfortunately. And it's about intellectual. It's the intellectual engagement, and it's about the whole of the university, not just a specific parochial part of the university. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to have this conversation. We want to engage you as champions. We want to build and support the networks that are already there, for example, as the Friends groups. We want to facilitate the broad-based mentoring, and this is particularly important for our younger alumni who are looking for jobs, they're looking for that advantage, and you can help. We want to make sure that we have a profile of connected alumni to make this community one that is whole and cohesive, and in some ways, most important for me, a kid who grew up a long way away in a small town with Indigenous people in my house. We want to hear your stories. Your stories are the lifeblood of the university. That's my presentation. Sorry, I went on a bit. Did I go too long, Warren? Okay, thank you very much. Do you want me to take questions?
Are there any questions for Kent that anyone may wish to raise about the presentation this evening? If not, I'm sure he'll be available outside after we finish the meeting to have discussions with you. Please thank Kent for his presentation tonight. The next item of this first ordinary meeting, item 9, is the Convocation Officers Report, and that's at attachment E of the booklet. This report is required by UWA statute, simply contains a list of the graduates whose current whereabouts have become unknown since the last ordinary meeting in September last year. To assist you to quickly locate colleagues and friends, we have sorted this list by faculty and year of graduation to hopefully help you check if there is anyone you may know. Please have a look at the list, and if you do know the whereabouts of any of those included, please contact Juanita Perez, the Convocation officer. She may be contacted at the Office of Convocation or via email at our normal email address, convocation@uwa.edu.au. That now brings me to item 10, which relates to other business. Is there any other business? Joan, I think, Tewu, if we can have that up there. As indicated earlier, we'll have the opportunity for other business now, and we'll also be having another meeting about that later. Joan.
Warden, I gave you a little bit of warning, so thank you for letting me be first in any other business. Many of us remember some years ago, well, some of us remember a long time ago, about 25 years ago, Convocation had its own newsletter. It was called Crawley. During about that time, 25 or so years ago, it was put to us that we should perhaps cease writing Crawley and distributing it to the members of Convocation. It would be really good for us if we joined in with UniView, and it was a very attractive proposition for all sorts of reasons, postage and distribution, but our stories, Kent, were indeed told. Now, I am surely not the only one who is somewhat distressed to find that this year there are only going to be 2 issues, not 6, not 4, as there has been for a number of years, but 2. Nevertheless, I'm privy, thanks to Warren and a group of friends who met the other day, to have one item in the survey which Kent referred to, which actually mentioned something like, now I don't know what the actual questions of the survey were. I was not one who was asked to respond to the survey. But it appeared to be something like, where do you get your information about the university? Top of the list, not the West Australian, not the local Post, although Brett does very well, UniView. 65% of whoever did the survey liked and got their information from UniView. Now, I just would put it to you, Warden, and Kent in particular, and the Vice-Chancellor, please. You don't have to answer this, but please think about it. If we're only going to get 2 UniViews, is this because you think all of us like to get stuff online? Lots of us don't. I want to get UniView and read it in the bath if I want to, not take my mobile phone.
Joan, could we just have the mic and we'll allow Kent to answer your question? A short sprint down the front. Thank you very much, Kent.
Thanks for the handoff. Joan, you're going to be surprised. You ready? You got to turn around to be surprised. I can't agree with you more. Absolutely agree. So you remember on the slide, or I came to the slide I forgot to put up there, and I had a third point that I forgot to mention. The third point was the print publication it comes out absolutely clear. It's really important to us, this community, and we would represent that. And what we want are your stories. In that, though, we're actually in the point where we need to go back and refresh that. Like any magazine, occasionally you need to come back and say, is it still doing what it needs to do? And we're in that period for probably about the next 6 months. I've already told the warden in our weekly meetings that we want to come to Convocation and say, you know, what do you want this to look like because it's your magazine? So absolutely agree.
Any other questions?
About your survey, it seems like your survey only received responses from 7,000 people. That's a small percentage compared to the cohort that you were after. So isn't that a bit biased because you jump to these conclusions that we want more of the I don't know, student experience and all that, all those things that rated high, but it's a very biased response. Sorry about that.
Absolutely happy to respond to that. So, indeed, the survey went to every single graduate for whom we have an email address for, and we got back...
Except all past members of Senate, all members of Council of all past and present members of Council of Convocation, and all the actively involved
Okay, Pauline, let me finish, and then you can come up with the technicalities on it. Okay, so the intention was to go out to everyone, and indeed, I can't remember the exact number, but it's about 65,000 people to who, it actually is lower than that, because we had about a 27% return rate, which again, remember we're benchmarked off 40 universities, and we actually did quite well on that one. It's one where we got more response than other universities did. So, did every single person who has ever been a graduate, who is a member of Convocation reply? No, they didn't. But we have, compared to other universities, we've got more participation. That number, again, 7,000 people we couldn't fit in this venue. So this venue right now, we're very happy to have 300 plus people, but 7,000 is bigger than that. The second one I would say is there's also a geographical bias that comes in. When we do use email, we're able to ask the people who are up north, the people who've moved overseas, the people not just who live in the neighborhood who can come spend the couple of hours with us. There's also an age distribution, and I have to share the numbers with the age, but we have an age distribution that is actually representative of the age of all graduates from the e-survey, which we don't always get from show-up surveys. So I take your point absolutely that we didn't get 100% response rate, but from all social science statistics we have, we did amazingly well.
Thank you very much, Ken. To be confident to our speaker, Devon, just one final question. Other item of other business.
It's not a question, but it is important that people do realise that none of the people who are actively involved in the university or friends committees or convocation or any of those things were surveyed. So it's people, it's not biased by people who are actively involved. They were all taken out of the survey.
Yeah, I think it's a good point to make. The survey was undertaken, and we received professional advice from a consultant specialising in that. The survey pro forma is the same that has been used at a number of other universities, which will now allow us, as Kent has indicated, to compare our results to other universities. And one of the issues that he was very strident about was because this has been done at other universities, it would bias the sample or disrupt the sample if we allowed it to go to everyone, whereas in all those other universities, what they'd been after is the rank and file opinion of graduates rather than those who are actively involved in either on the Senate, on Convocation, on a number of those types of issues. So the survey went out to many who are not necessarily actively involved in the university, and it was therefore to get their opinions on this. Can we have the microphone for Kent? Sure. Look at that.
So thank you. Now I understand the question, and I'm sorry, I just wasn't understanding the question and the point. And so it was a question about the big definition of graduates and the big definition of Senate and the big definition of Convocation. And so my apologies for not getting that. Warren's already responded in the sense from good social science methodology why we did it the way we did it. But let me give a more nuanced one, which is we go out to community members as well to get a net performance indicator. And we'll do that. We do that on a regular basis with both the political community and so politicians and people in the community. We'll continue to do that, and I would love to hear those voices as well. Let me just stop here to try to indicate very strongly what I'm trying to do right now. What I'm trying to do is enter into a dialogue and a conversation. So I'm not trying to tell you this is what it is, and you tell me, no, it's not. What I'm trying to do is have a conversation about how we can make it the best for you. It is your thing. And so I take that criticism, but my response is, rather than a criticism, well, let's make sure we capture those voices as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. We have one last item of other business, and that's I've received a request to ask if there are any members of Convocation who may wish to volunteer to assist graduands at the graduation ceremonies coming up during March. If you are interested in assisting with the graduation ceremonies by looking after graduands preparing for their graduation, answering questions, etc., could you please see Juanita Perez at the Convocation office? And as mentioned earlier in the meeting, certainly Convocation Council welcomes everyone who is interested in serving on the council. We had received a number of nominations prior to this meeting which equalled the number of vacancies. If there are those who wish to be on council, please let us know. We will now have a special meeting and we will have an election at that meeting to formalise the outcome of that Convocation election. If there's no other business, I'd therefore like to declare the meeting closed and introduce our guest speaker for this evening.